Hi everybody, thank you for tuning back in to our series about restoring our 1969 Volkswagen Type 3. Today we're jumping into disassembly, and to start with, we are removing the gauges. As you can probably see, getting these gauges out is no picnic. It requires you to reach your hand way up underneath the dash and push the gauges out from the back, while also depressing two clips that live on either side. Now, although we had some success and you can see the gauge on the far right start to wiggle, we did eventually find it necessary to actually remove the fuse box underneath the dash so that we could get a little bit more access. With the fuse box out of the way, there is finally just enough room to fit your hand up behind the dash and get enough purchase to actually push the clock out. With a little bit more elbow grease and that increased access from behind the dash, we were finally able to get the clock out from its position. As you can see, the gauges are in reasonable shape, but they do have a little bit of corrosion around the rim. Next, it's just a matter of disconnecting a few wires, which requires the use of pliers to pull apart the connectors. Although these gauges are in reasonable shape, we have no idea if they actually work because, well, the car has never run since we've owned it. We do want to use them again if we can, but the clock at least is not going to be going back in because we do plan on putting in a tachometer instead. You can see us here struggling to remove the central speedometer, but eventually we did find that it was necessary to remove the leftmost gauge pod first so that you can attack the central speedo from both sides. In the process of pulling out that left gauge, we did accidentally break it, and the backing plate to which all of the wires attached just detached itself from the main body of the gauge. We also eventually figured out that in order to get that backing plate out, we actually had to disconnect the wire from the other end where it plugged in at the fuse box. Getting the speedo out eventually did require all three of us. My dad and I each pushed in from the sides to depress the clips, while my mom reached her hand up inside the dash and pushed it out from behind. At that point, we were able to just kind of wiggle it free from the front and disconnect the few connectors behind it. This one wire was pretty stubborn, and it did take a while to get out. And if you're wondering why throughout this video you'll see that we linger on these wires quite a bit, it's because we're using this footage as a reference for when we have to put it all back together. There's not really a particular order that we're approaching this in, so the next task that we decided to tackle was removing the passenger side rear fender. There are a few bolts that hold these rear fenders on, one at the back, as you can see here, that I'm undoing. There are also a few inside the car that you have to use an extension to get to, and there are also a couple on the underside of the fender where it meets the pan. There were two bolts holding the rear quarter panel on just forward of the rear wheel, and one of them came out really easily. The other, unfortunately, I snapped. And so you can see the wrench is kind of just spinning. It's not doing anything, but thankfully the panel was able to just sort of pop off of what was left of that bolt, and we will just have to drill it out a little bit later. In addition to the bolts, there was also a rivet that held the rear quarter panel to the side of the rear hatch. And in order to get it out, we just ground off the head of the rivet and then subsequently drilled out the rest. And that was the last thing really holding the rear fender on. So at this point we had removed all of the hardware that actually held the fender on, and we were really confused as to why it wasn't coming off until my dad reached in and just pulled it backwards a little bit, and it basically just fell off. Our next task was to remove the fuel sending unit so that we could rip out the fuel tank. When this car was parked, we thought it had some fuel in it, and that fuel has since turned into something really nasty, so this tank will need a full clean. With the 5 bolts that hold the sending unit down to the fuel tank out, it should have been a pretty simple matter to just lift the unit out. However, this was one stubborn piece of machinery, and it turned out that we just needed more leverage. So as you can see, we did end up using a socket extension to create a fulcrum point and allow us to get just a little bit more leverage under the lid. Remember how earlier I said that the fuel inside this tank had turned into something nasty? Well, as this comes out, just take a look at the Coca-Cola brown color. Next up, it was time to put the car up on jacks. We are fortunate enough to have a set of these quick jacks, which make this job a lot easier, but do also throw in a little bit of complication. Because this is a rear-engine car, and the weight sits so far back, it's actually pretty difficult to get this car to a proper balancing point on quick jacks. Although it took us about an hour, we did eventually come up with a solution that allowed the car to balance properly. Now, that solution involved running a 2x4 underneath the body of the car with a piece of wood on either end that lines up with the chassis weld lines, and this spreads the weight out evenly enough and allows us to put it far enough forward that the car can balance properly on these quick jacks. It's never a good sign when you have to break out a blowtorch in order to get a wheel off, but even after removing all 4 lug nuts, both front wheels were completely welded. After a lot of heat and a lot of time and a lot of smacking this wheel with a hammer, I did finally break it loose and get it off the car. Through about the same process, I got the one on the other side off as well, and all 4 wheels were finally off of the vehicle. With the car up in the air, the wheels off, and some of the areas beneath the fuel tank now much more accessible, we decided to finish the job of getting the fuel tank out of the car. In order to do this, we had to remove the fuel filler neck, as well as several bolts that held the fuel tank down to the chassis of the car. At this point, we were almost ready to pull the fuel tank completely out of the car, but first we had to disconnect the fuel lines running from the bottom of the tank. After removing the sending unit for the final time, we put the bolts back into their original holes, but as you can see, one found its way inside the tank. So we had to fish it out using an extendable magnet, which is always a good time. With that taken care of, it was time to finally get that fuel filler neck completely removed from the tank. And with that, the tank was mostly free. We were able to lift it up just high enough to remove those fuel lines that we saw earlier, and once those were off, we were able to lift the tank all the way out of the front of the car. We planned on having the tank professionally cleaned, which meant that that fuel fitting on the bottom had to go. It took us a while to figure out what the wrench size is, and unfortunately I don't remember, but it was something kind of absurdly large. Eventually though, we found the right one, and were able to get it off. Getting the fuel tank out of the car feels like a little bit of a milestone. With it out of the way, we're able to see a lot of the front suspension components, including the steering box, and of course a lot of the fuel system that lives underneath it. We're finally starting to make some really good progress on getting this car torn down, but there's still a lot of work yet to do. We're excited to keep sharing this journey with you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.